High in the remote peaks of the Cascade Mountains, a 7-year-old boy named Eli stood alone on the porch of a crumbling cabin, watching the taillights of his uncle's truck disappear down the winding dirt road. He had been told his parents were dead, killed in a logging accident 3 months ago, and that no one in the family wanted him. The boy had nothing but a thin jacket, a box of matches, and the crushing weight of abandonment. As darkness crept through the ancient pines and the temperature plummeted toward freezing, Eli realized the terrible truth. He would have to survive the night by himself or die trying. But what the boy didn't know was that his parents hadn't died in any accident. They had been murdered, and the people responsible were closer than he could possibly imagine. What had his parents discovered that cost them their lives, and why had Eli been left alive? The truck rattled and groaned as it climbed the narrow mountain road, its tires spitting gravel into the endless green abyss that fell away on one side. Eli sat in the passenger seat, his small frame pressed against the door, as far from his uncle as the cramped cabin would allow. He was 7 years old, small for his age, with a mop of dark brown hair that fell across his forehead and into his eyes that were the color of mountain streams and held a depth of sorrow no child should know. His face was pale and thin, the remnants of baby fat long since eroded by 3 months of grief and neglect. He wore a red t-shirt that was too big for him, a hand-me-down from a cousin who had never spoken to him, and jeans with holes in the knees. His sneakers were worn through at the toes, and his thin blue jacket, clutched in his lap, offered about as much protection from the cold as a paper bag. His uncle, Dale, was a large man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, his hands thick and rough on the steering wheel. He had not said a single word since they left the county welfare office 4 hours ago, and the silence in the truck was a living thing, oppressive and cold. Eli had learned not to speak, not to ask questions, not to exist any more than he absolutely had to in his uncle's presence. The trees grew thicker as they climbed, the pines and firs pressing in on the road like silent sentinels, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the gray October sky. The air grew colder, thinner, and Eli could see his breath beginning to mist in front of his face. Finally, the truck lurched to a stop. Eli looked through the dirty windshield and saw a cabin, though calling it that seemed generous. It was a small, sagging structure of dark logs, its roof covered in moss and missing shingles, its windows cracked or broken, its porch listing dangerously to one side. It looked like something the forest was slowly swallowing, a place forgotten by time and man alike. Dale cut the engine and sat for a moment, staring straight ahead. Then he turned to Eli, and his eyes were flat, devoid of any warmth or familial affection. "This is where you live now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Your mama and daddy are gone, and nobody else wants you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box of matches, tossing them into Eli's lap. "That's more than you deserve," he continued, his lip curling into a sneer. "You should have died with them." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, and he felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to ask why, but his voice was trapped somewhere deep inside him, frozen by fear and disbelief. Dale reached across him, his thick arm brushing roughly against Eli's chest, and pushed open the passenger door. "Get out," he ordered. Eli stumbled out of the truck, his feet landing on the soft, damp earth. He clutched the box of matches in one hand and his thin jacket in the other. He turned back to the truck, some small, desperate part of him hoping for a reprieve, for a sign that this was all a terrible joke. But Dale did not look at him. He simply put the truck in reverse, swung it around in a rough arc, and drove away down the mountain road. Eli stood there, motionless, watching the taillights disappear around a bend, the sound of the engine fading until it was swallowed by the immense silence of the wilderness, and then he was alone. Truly and completely alone, a small boy in a thin jacket, standing before a crumbling cabin in the shadow of the indifferent mountains. The silence that followed his uncle's departure was unlike anything Eli had ever experienced. It was not the comfortable quiet of his old bedroom at night, or the peaceful stillness of a Sunday morning. This silence was vast and absolute, a void that pressed in on him from all sides, filling his ears with a hollow roar. He stood on the rotting porch, his small body trembling, staring at the spot where the truck had vanished into the trees. Some part of him, the part that still believed in fairness and love and the basic goodness of family, expected the truck to reappear, expected his uncle to come back and say he was sorry, that he didn't mean it, that no one would ever leave a child alone in the wilderness to fend for himself. But the road remained empty, and the forest remained silent, and Eli remained alone. He didn't know how long he stood there, minutes or hours, his mind unable to process the enormity of what had happened. The cold finally drove him to move. It crept through his thin jacket and his worn t-shirt, wrapping around his bones and squeezing. He turned slowly and faced the cabin. Up close, it was even worse than it had appeared from the truck. The logs were dark with age and moisture, many of them soft with rot. The single window beside the door was shattered, leaving a jagged mouth of broken glass. The door itself hung crooked on its hinges, a dark gap showing where it no longer met the frame. The smell hit him before he even touched the door, a thick, sour odor of decay and animal waste that made his stomach lurch. He reached out a small hand and pushed. The door swung inward with a loud, protesting creak that echoed in the emptiness. He stepped over the threshold and into the gloom. The interior was a single room, perhaps 15 feet square. The floorboards were warped and covered in a layer of dirt and debris. Against one wall stood a rusted iron stove, its pipe disappearing into the ceiling, a small pile of ancient ashes spilling from its open door. Against the opposite wall was a cot, just a metal frame with a thin, stained mattress that was torn in several places, its stuffing pulled out by some animal for nesting material. There was a small table with one leg shorter than the others, and a single chair that was missing its back. The walls were bare log, chinked with crumbling mortar that had fallen away in large patches, leaving gaps to the outside. The other window, on the far wall, was also broken, and a cold breeze flowed through the room, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth, mixing with the stench of rot. There was nothing else, no food, no blankets, no sign that any human had cared for this place in years. Eli walked to the center of the room, his footsteps sounding impossibly loud in the silence. He turned in a slow circle, taking it all in, his young mind trying to reconcile this reality with everything he had known. 3 months ago, he had a home, a warm bed, a mother who sang to him, and a father who carried him on his shoulders. Now he had this, a ruin in the wilderness, a place not fit for an animal, and he had been thrown away here like garbage. The weight of it, the sheer crushing weight of his abandonment, his parents' death, his uncle's cruelty, the impossible future that stretched before him, suddenly became too much. His legs buckled, and he sank to the floor, his knees hitting the dirty boards. A sob tore from his throat, then another, and then he was crying, really crying, his small body shaking with the force of it. He curled into himself, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face buried, and he wept for his mother and father, for his lost home, for the terrified and lonely boy he had become, the sound of his cries swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the mountains. Eli did not know how long he lay curled on the filthy floor, his small body racked with sobs until there were no more tears left to cry. When he finally lifted his head, the light in the cabin had changed. The gray afternoon had deepened into something darker, the shadows in the corners of the room growing longer and blacker, stretching toward him like grasping fingers. Through the broken windows, he could see the sky turning a deep purple, the first stars beginning to appear above the jagged silhouette of the pines. And with the coming darkness came the cold. It was not the mild chill of earlier, but something far more serious, a biting, penetrating cold that seeped through the gaps in the walls and through his thin clothing and into his very bones. His teeth began to chatter, and he could see his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. He knew, with a clarity that cut through his grief and fear, that if he did not get warm, he would not survive the night. He could die here, on this floor, and no one would ever know or care. The thought was terrifying, but it was also galvanizing. Something stirred within him, a small spark of defiance, a will to live that he did not know he possessed. He pushed himself up onto his knees, his body stiff and aching, and he looked at the old iron stove against the wall. A memory surfaced, unbidden but welcome. It was a summer evening, perhaps a year ago, in the backyard of his old house. His father had been teaching him how to build a campfire. Eli could see him so clearly, his strong hands arranging the kindling, his patient voice explaining each step. "You need 3 things, El," his father had said. "You need fuel, you need air, and you need a spark. Get those 3 together, and you can make fire anywhere." The memory brought a fresh pang of grief, but Eli held on to it, using it as a guide. He looked around the dim cabin, searching for fuel. The floor was littered with debris, and he crawled across it, his hands sifting through the dirt and dust. He found scraps of old newspaper, yellowed and brittle, shoved into a corner. He found dry wood splinters and small pieces of broken board near the base of the walls where the rot had caused the logs to flake apart. He gathered everything he could find, his small hands working quickly, and he brought it all to the stove. He opened the stove's iron door, the hinges screaming in protest, and he peered inside. There was a bed of old ash, and above it, a small grate. He carefully arranged the newspaper on the grate, crumpling it loosely as his father had shown him to let the air flow through. On top of the newspaper, he placed the smallest, driest splinters of wood, building a little nest. His hands were shaking, from cold and from fear, as he pulled the box of matches from his pocket. He opened it and counted. There were 12 matches, 12 chances. He took out the first match, pressed it against the striking strip, and dragged it across. It sputtered and died. He tried a second. It broke in half. A third flared briefly, then went out before he could bring it to the newspaper. Panic began to claw at him. He forced himself to stop, to breathe, to remember his father's calm voice. Steady, El. Take your time. He took out a fourth match and struck it slowly, deliberately. It caught, a small, bright flame dancing on the tip. He cupped his other hand around it, shielding it from the draft, and carefully, he brought it to the edge of the crumpled newspaper. The paper caught. A tiny flame, no bigger than a fingertip, began to spread, licking at the edges, growing, reaching for the dry splinters above it. Eli watched, barely breathing, as the splinters began to smoke, then to glow, then to burn. Within minutes, a small but real fire was crackling inside the stove, its orange light spilling out into the dark cabin, its warmth reaching out to touch his frozen skin. He closed the stove door partway, allowing air to feed the flames but containing the heat. He sat back on his heels and stared at the fire, and for the first time since his uncle's truck had disappeared down the mountain, he felt something other than despair. It was a small feeling, fragile as the flame itself, but it was there. It was hope, and it was victory. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the cabin, and Eli sat as close to it as he dared, his back pressed against the rough iron, absorbing every bit of warmth he could. He had fed the flames carefully, adding small pieces of wood he had scavenged from the floor, terrified that if he added too much or too little the fire would die and he would be left alone in the freezing darkness. The heat was a blessing, pushing back the worst of the cold, but it could not push back everything else. The cabin was full of sounds, or rather, the world outside the cabin was full of sounds, and they filtered in through the broken windows and the gaps in the walls with terrifying clarity. The wind moved through the pines with a low, mournful moan that rose and fell like breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a long, wavering cry that was answered by another, and then another, until it seemed the entire mountain was calling out in a language Eli could not understand. Closer, much closer, he heard the rustle of something moving through the underbrush just outside the cabin, the snap of a twig, the soft pad of footsteps. He strained his eyes toward the broken window, his heart hammering in his chest, but he could see nothing beyond the glass except the impenetrable black of the night. Every sound made him flinch, made him imagine yellow eyes watching him from the darkness, sharp teeth and claws waiting for the fire to die. He drew his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, making himself as small as possible, and he did not sleep. He could not sleep. His body was exhausted, pushed beyond its limits, but his mind would not quiet. It raced in endless circles, replaying the events of the day, the weeks, the months that had led him to this place. He thought about his uncle's words, cold and final, and he thought about the family members who had refused to take him in, the aunts and cousins who had looked at him at his parents' funeral and then looked away, as if he were something shameful, something to be avoided. But most of all, he thought about his parents. He thought about his mother's laugh, the way it would fill their small house and make everything feel bright and safe. He thought about his father's hands, strong and calloused from work, but always gentle when they ruffled Eli's hair or lifted him onto his shoulders. He thought about the last morning he had seen them, a ordinary Tuesday, his mother packing his lunch, his father reading the newspaper at the kitchen table. Eli had been in a rush, worried about being late for school, and he had barely said goodbye. He had not hugged them. He had not told them he loved them. He had just grabbed his backpack and run out the door, and that was the last time. The sheriff had come to his school that afternoon. Eli remembered being called out of class, remembered walking down the long hallway to the principal's office, confused but not yet afraid. The sheriff was a big man with a kind face, and he had knelt down so he was at Eli's eye level, and he had spoken softly, but the words were like bombs, each one destroying another piece of Eli's world. "There was an accident," the sheriff had said. "At the logging site. Your mom and dad, they didn't make it, son. I'm so sorry." Eli had not understood at first. The words did not make sense, could not make sense, because his parents were supposed to pick him up after school, they were supposed to have dinner together, they were supposed to be there. But they were not there, and they would never be there again, and Eli's life had ended in that moment even as his heart kept beating. He reached into his pocket now, his fingers closing around the cold metal of his father's compass. It was a simple thing, brass, well-worn from years of use, the glass face scratched but still clear. His father had carried it always, had taught Eli how to read it, how to find north, how to find his way. Eli had taken it from his father's nightstand the day after the funeral, slipping it into his pocket before anyone could see, needing something, anything, to hold on to. He pulled it out now and held it in his palm, and the needle swung gently, settling toward north, steady and sure even in this terrible place. He clutched it to his chest and he cried, silently, the tears streaming down his face and soaking into his shirt, and he cried for his mother and his father and for himself, alone and abandoned on a cold mountain, with nothing but a fire and a compass and the long, dark night stretching out before him. Eli did not remember falling asleep, but he must have at some point, because he woke with a start to find pale gray light filtering through the broken windows of the cabin. The fire in the stove had died down to a bed of glowing embers, and the cold had crept back in, settling over him like a damp blanket. His body was stiff and aching from spending the night on the hard floor, his muscles cramped and sore, and for a moment he did not know where he was. Then, the memories came rushing back, his uncle's truck, the cabin, the long, terrible night, and he felt the weight of his situation settle over him once more. But there was something else now, something more immediate and demanding than grief or fear. He was hungry, he was thirstier, his stomach cramped painfully, and his throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. He had not eaten since the morning before, a meager breakfast of toast at the welfare office, and he had not had anything to drink since the water fountain in the hallway. His body was crying out for sustenance, and he knew that if he did not find food and water soon, all the fire building in the world would not save him. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him, and he walked to the cabin door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand on the rough wood, remembering the sounds of the night, the rustling and the howling, the unseen creatures moving in the darkness, but the daylight gave him courage. He pushed the door open and stepped out onto the sagging porch. The morning was cold and still, the sky a flat white overcast that seemed to press down on the mountains. The forest surrounded the cabin on all sides, a dense wall of pine and fir, their branches heavy with moisture. Everything was wet, the porch, the ground, the air itself, and Eli could see his breath misting before him. He stepped off the porch and onto the soft earth, his worn sneakers immediately soaking through. He stood still for a moment, listening, watching, but the forest was quiet, the night creatures having retreated to wherever they went when the sun came up. He needed water first. That was the most urgent thing. He remembered his father telling him that you could survive weeks without food, but only days without water, and his throat was so parched he could barely think of anything else. He looked around, trying to orient himself, and then he heard it, a faint sound, soft and musical, coming from somewhere to his left, running water. He followed the sound, pushing through a thicket of ferns and over a fallen log, and after a few minutes he found it, a small creek, perhaps 2 feet wide, flowing over a bed of smooth stones. The water was clear and cold, catching what little light there was and sparkling. Eli dropped to his knees on the muddy bank and plunged his hands into the stream. The cold was shocking, so intense it was almost painful, but he did not care. He cupped his hands and brought the water to his lips and drank. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted, clean and pure, and he drank and drank until his stomach ached with it. He sat back on his heels, gasping, water dripping down his chin, and he felt a little strength returning to his limbs, a little clarity to his mind. Food was next. He stood and looked around, searching the underbrush for anything edible. His father had taught him some things about foraging, pointing out plants on their hikes, and Eli tried to remember. He spotted a bush a few yards away, its branches dotted with small, dark berries. He approached it cautiously, examining the fruit. They were deep blue, almost black, and they looked like the huckleberries his mother used to put in pancakes. He picked one and squeezed it, and the juice that ran out was a dark purple. He smelled it, and it smelled sweet. He put it in his mouth, and the taste was tart but good. He ate more, stripping the berries from the branches and shoving them into his mouth, the juice staining his fingers and his lips. They were not much, but they were something, and his body accepted them gratefully. When the bush was bare, he stood there in the gray morning light, his stomach no longer empty, his thirst quenched, and he felt for just a moment that perhaps he could do this, perhaps he could survive. The days that followed blurred together into a relentless cycle of survival, each one presenting new challenges that Eli had no choice but to meet. He learned quickly that staying alive in this place required constant effort, constant vigilance, and that the moment he stopped working was the moment the wilderness would begin to reclaim him. The cold was his most persistent enemy, creeping into the cabin through every crack and gap, and he knew that if he did not find a way to keep it out, he would not last long. He started with the windows. The broken glass let in the wind and the rain, and on his second morning he woke to find a puddle of water on the floor beneath the shattered pane. He walked around the outside of the cabin, studying its construction, looking for anything he could use. The porch was in the worst shape, its boards warped and rotting, and he realized that he could salvage material from it without compromising his shelter. He found a board that was loose, the nails rusted nearly through, and he worked at it with his small hands, pulling and twisting until it came free. It was not easy. The wood was stubborn, and the nails tore at his palms, leaving them raw and bleeding, but he did not stop. He carried the board inside and held it up against the broken window. It was not a perfect fit, but it covered most of the opening. He looked around for something to secure it with and found a few bent nails on the floor and a heavy stone that could serve as a hammer. He pounded the nails through the board and into the window frame, each strike sending a jarring shock up his arm. But when he was finished, the board held. The wind no longer howled through that window, and Eli felt a small surge of pride. He had fixed something. He had made his shelter a little bit better. The fire was his next focus. On that first night, he had nearly let it die, waking in the small hours to find the flames reduced to embers, the cold rushing back in. He could not let that happen again. He learned to bank the fire before he slept, piling ash around the coals to keep them hot, adding a large piece of wood that would burn slowly through the night. He learned to gather fuel during the day, venturing out into the forest to collect fallen branches and dead wood, stacking them beside the stove so they would be dry and ready. He learned to read the fire, to know when it needed more air and when it needed more fuel, to coax it back to life when it faltered. Each night, he tended it like a living thing, because in a way, it was his life. The hardest part was not the physical labor. The hardest part was the loneliness. The silence of the cabin was immense, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the sounds of the forest outside, and it pressed in on him until he thought he would scream. He began to talk to himself, just to hear a human voice. He narrated his actions as he performed them, describing what he was doing and why, and the sound of his own words, thin and small in the empty room, was a comfort. Sometimes he pretended his parents were with him. He would imagine his father standing beside him as he worked on the fire, nodding in approval, offering advice. "Good job, El," he would say. "You are doing great. Keep the air flowing." He would imagine his mother sitting on the cot, watching him with her warm smile, telling him how proud she was. These conversations were not real, and Eli knew they were not real, but they helped. They made him feel less alone. They reminded him of who he was and where he came from, and they gave him the strength to keep going. He would talk to them as he gathered wood, as he ate his meager meals of berries and creek water, as he lay down to sleep at night. He told them about his day, about what he had learned, about how much he missed them. And in the silence that followed, he could almost believe they were listening. Eli had lost track of the days, but he thought it had been about a week since his uncle had driven away and left him to the mountain. He had fallen into a rhythm, a pattern of survival that consumed every waking hour. He woke with the light, coaxed the fire back to life, went to the creek for water, foraged for whatever berries or edible plants he could find, gathered wood, and tended the cabin. His hands were raw and blistered, his clothes filthy, his body thinner than it had ever been. But he was alive. He was surviving. He was outside the cabin that morning, stacking wood against the wall, when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a sound he had not heard since his uncle's truck had disappeared down the road. It was footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. His heart seized in his chest, and he dropped the piece of wood he was holding, his eyes scanning the tree line. A figure emerged from the forest, and Eli's first instinct was to run, to hide, to disappear into the cabin and barricade the door. But something held him in place, a curiosity that was stronger than his fear. The figure was not his uncle. It was not a man at all. It was an old woman, short and stout, with a face like a weathered apple, all wrinkles and creases, and sharp gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a heavy canvas coat and mud-caked boots, and she carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. She walked with a slight limp, but moved with a purpose that belied her age. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at Eli, and Eli looked back at her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "So you are the boy," the woman said finally. Her voice was gruff, almost harsh, with no warmth in it. Eli did not know what to say, so he said nothing. The woman crossed the clearing and climbed the steps to the porch, her boots heavy on the rotting boards. She stopped in front of Eli and looked him up and down, her gaze critical, assessing. "You are skinnier than I expected," she said, "and dirtier." She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past him and into the cabin, and Eli followed, not knowing what else to do. The woman stood in the center of the room, looking around at the bare cot, the stove, the boarded window, and Eli saw her nod slightly, as if she approved of something. She swung the burlap sack off her shoulder and dropped it on the floor. It landed with a heavy thud. "There are potatoes in there," she said, "and a wool blanket. You will need both." Eli stared at the sack, then at the woman. He did not understand. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned to face him, and for the first time, her expression softened, just a little, just around the edges. "My name is Maggie," she said. "I live about 2 miles down the mountain, on the other side of the ridge. I keep to myself, and I expect others to do the same. But I knew your parents." Eli felt his breath catch in his throat. "You knew them," he repeated. Maggie nodded. "They came up here a few times, asking questions, poking around. Your father especially. He was a curious man, always wanting to know things." She paused, and something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been sadness or might have been anger. "They were good people," she said. "Honest people, and I can see they raised a good son." She looked at Eli, and her gaze was piercing, as if she could see right through him to his very core. "You have got their strength in you, boy. I can see it. You have made it a week out here on your own, and that is more than most grown men could do." Eli did not feel strong. He felt small and scared and desperately alone. But something in the old woman's words kindled a warmth in his chest, a faint glow of pride that he clung to. Maggie turned and walked toward the door. "I will come back in a few days," she said over her shoulder. "Try not to die before then." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the forest, leaving Eli alone with a sack of potatoes, a wool blanket, and the first real hope he had felt since his parents died. True to her word, Maggie returned 3 days later, appearing at the edge of the clearing with the same heavy footsteps and the same gruff demeanor. She brought with her a coil of thin wire and a small knife with a wooden handle, and she did not waste time with greetings or pleasantries. She simply looked at Eli and said, "Come with me," and then she turned and walked back into the forest. Eli followed without question, his legs struggling to keep up with her surprisingly brisk pace. She led him through the trees to a small clearing where the underbrush was thick with low shrubs and fallen logs. She stopped and pointed at the ground, at a narrow trail worn into the vegetation, a path no wider than a few inches. "Rabbit Run," she said. "They use the same paths over and over, predictable creatures." She knelt down, her movements stiff but practiced, and she began to work with the wire, bending it and shaping it into a loop. Eli watched, mesmerized, as her gnarled fingers moved with surprising dexterity. She explained each step as she went, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, showing him how to anchor the snare, how to position it at the right height, how to make the loop the right size. "You check it every morning," she said. "If you leave an animal too long, something else will get to it first, or it will spoil. Waste is the one sin the mountain does not forgive." She made him set the next snare himself, watching with her sharp eyes as he fumbled with the wire, correcting him when he made mistakes, grunting in approval when he got it right. It was not praise, not exactly, but from Maggie it felt like the highest compliment. Over the following weeks, she came every few days, always unannounced, always with something new to teach. She showed him which plants were safe to eat and which would make him sick, pointing out the differences in leaf shape and color that distinguished nourishment from poison. She taught him to recognize wild onions by their smell, to find tubers by the shape of their leaves, to harvest pine needles for a tea that would keep away something she called scurvy. She taught him to read the sky, to see the signs of coming weather in the color of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. When the sparrows fly low, rain is coming, she told him. When the sky turns green, find shelter fast. She was not a warm woman. She did not smile, or offer comfort or tell Eli that everything would be all right. She was sparing with her words, speaking only when she had something worth saying, and she expected Eli to listen and learn and remember. She had no patience for complaints or self-pity, and when Eli struggled with a task, she did not help him. She simply watched and waited for him to figure it out himself. But she was generous with her knowledge, sharing the hard-won wisdom of a lifetime spent living on the mountain, and Eli soaked it up like a sponge. He began to see the forest differently, not as a hostile and unknowable wilderness but as a place that could provide for him if he learned its rules. He checked his snares each morning and felt a surge of triumph the first time he found a rabbit in one, its body still warm. He learned to skin it and clean it, his stomach turning at first but his hunger overriding his squeamishness, and he roasted it over the fire and ate every scrap of meat. He gathered plants and roots, supplementing his diet of potatoes and berries, and he began to feel stronger, more capable. He learned to watch the sky and to prepare for storms before they hit, bringing in extra wood and sealing the gaps in the cabin walls with mud and moss. For the first time since his parents died, Eli began to see a path forward, not just surviving the next night or the next week, but the coming winter. It would be hard, harder than anything he had ever faced, but Maggie was showing him that it was possible. He was learning to live on the mountain, and with each passing day, his fear gave way to something else, something that felt almost like confidence. It was a cold evening, the kind where the air itself seemed to crystallize, and the trees stood rigid against the darkening sky. Maggie had stayed later than usual, sitting on the cabin's single chair while Eli sat on the floor near the stove, the warmth of the fire pushing back against the chill that seeped through the walls. She had brought him a small pot, dented but functional, and had shown him how to make a simple stew from rabbit meat, wild onions, and the last of the potatoes. They ate in silence, as was their custom, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of their spoons against the metal. Eli had grown accustomed to Maggie's quiet, had learned to find comfort in it, but tonight she seemed different. There was a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes, as if something was weighing on her mind. He watched her over his bowl, wondering if he should ask, but he knew better than to pry. Maggie shared what she wanted to share and nothing more. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than usual, almost reluctant. "Your father was a stubborn man," she said, not looking at Eli but staring into the fire. Once he got an idea in his head, there was no shaking it loose. Eli lowered his spoon, his attention sharpening. Maggie rarely spoke about his parents, and when she did, it was only in brief, general terms. This felt different. He was asking questions, Maggie continued, her tone carefully neutral. "Before he died, he and your mother both. They were poking around, talking to people, trying to find out things about the logging company, Cascade Timber." The name hit Eli like a punch to the stomach. He knew Cascade Timber. Everyone in the region knew them. They were the biggest employer in the county, their trucks a constant presence on the mountain roads, their operations sprawling across thousands of acres. His father had worked for them, at least for a while, before he quit and took a job at the mill in town. Eli remembered his parents talking about the company in hushed voices, remembered the tension in his father's jaw whenever their name came up, but he had never understood why. "What kind of questions?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line, and she shook her head slightly, as if she had already said too much. "Dangerous questions," she said, "the kind that make powerful people nervous." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and she carried her bowl to the table. Eli watched her, his mind racing, a cold knot forming in his chest. "Maggie," he said, his voice cracking. "What happened to my parents? Was it really an accident?" The old woman froze, her back to him, and for a long moment she did not move or speak. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, and Eli felt his heart pounding against his ribs. When Maggie finally turned around, her face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "It is late," she said, her tone flat, final. "I need to get back before full dark." She crossed to the door, moving faster than usual, and she did not look at Eli as she pulled it open. "You focus on surviving, boy," she said, one foot already on the porch. "That is what matters. Leave the past where it is." And then she was gone, swallowed by the twilight, leaving Eli alone with the fire and the silence and the question that now burned in his mind like an ember that would not die. He sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door, Maggie's words echoing in his head. Dangerous questions, powerful people. He thought about his parents, about the way they had died, about the story he had been told. A logging accident, a terrible tragedy. These things happen. But did they? Eli pulled his father's compass from his pocket and held it in his palm, watching the needle settle toward north, steady and unwavering. His father had always told him that the truth was like that needle, that it always pointed in one direction no matter how much you tried to spin it. For the first time, Eli began to wonder if the truth about his parents' death was something very different from what he had been told. The question Maggie had planted in Eli's mind would not let him rest. It gnawed at him during the day as he checked his snares and gathered wood, and it kept him awake at night as he lay on the cot beneath the wool blanket, staring at the ceiling while the fire crackled and popped. He could not stop thinking about his parents, about the logging company, about the dangerous questions they had been asking. He needed to know more, needed to understand what they had been doing and why it might have gotten them killed. But Maggie would not speak of it again, deflecting his questions with grunts and silence, and there was no one else to ask. He was alone on the mountain with nothing but his thoughts and his suspicions. He began to explore. At first, he stayed close to the cabin, venturing only as far as the creek and the berry bushes, the small territory he had mapped in his first days of survival. But as the days passed and his confidence grew, he pushed further, following deer trails and dry creek beds, learning the shape of the land around him. The forest was vast and dense, a maze of pine and fir and underbrush, but Eli was careful, always marking his path so he could find his way back, always keeping track of the position of the sun. It was on one of these explorations, perhaps 2 weeks after Maggie's unsettling visit, that he found the footpath. It was overgrown, nearly invisible beneath a tangle of ferns and fallen branches, but something about it caught his eye, a regularity to the depression in the earth, a sense that this was not a deer trail but something made by human feet. He knelt and brushed away the debris, and he could see it more clearly. A narrow path leading up the mountain, switchbacking through the trees. He followed it. The going was slow, the path choked with vegetation that had grown unchecked for years, but it was still passable. He climbed for nearly an hour, his legs burning, his breath coming in short gasps in the thin mountain air. The trees began to thin, and the slope grew steeper, and then he came around a bend and he stopped, his heart lurching in his chest. He knew this place. It was a small clearing on the edge of a rocky outcrop, overlooking a deep mountain pool fed by a thin waterfall. The pool was dark and clear, its surface like glass, and the rocks around it were covered in soft green moss. Eli had been here before. His father had brought him here, years ago, when he was very small. They had fished in this pool, casting their lines into the cold water, sitting in comfortable silence, while the world went on without them far below. It was one of Eli's most treasured memories, a day of perfect peace and happiness, and standing here now, alone, the loss of his father hit him with a force that nearly drove him to his knees. He sat on a rock by the edge of the pool, his eyes stinging, and he let the grief wash over him. He missed his father so much. He missed his voice and his laugh, and the way he could make everything feel safe just by being there. He missed his mother, her warmth and her kindness and the songs she used to sing. He missed his old life, his home, his room, his friends, the world that had been taken from him. He did not know how long he sat there, but eventually the tears stopped, and a strange calm settled over him. He looked around the clearing with new eyes, and he remembered something. His father had shown him a spot here, a hollow beneath a distinctive rock shaped like a bear's head, where he kept his fishing tackle. It was their secret place, his father had said, a place just for them. Eli crossed the clearing to the rock, his pulse quickening. He knelt and reached into the hollow, his fingers brushing against cold stone, and then they touched something else, something smooth and slick. He pulled it out. It was a waterproof pouch, heavy-duty, the kind his father used for camping gear. It was dusty but intact, sealed tight against the elements. Eli's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his father's handwriting, and a collection of photographs held together with a rubber band. He stared at them, and he knew, with a certainty that went beyond words, that he had just found what his father had died to protect. Eli carried the pouch back to the cabin as if it were made of glass, cradling it against his chest, terrified that he might drop it or damage it or somehow lose the precious contents inside. The sun was beginning to set by the time he returned, the sky turning shades of orange and purple above the peaks, and he hurried inside, bolting the door behind him and feeding the fire until it roared with warmth and light. He sat on the floor beside the stove, the journal in his lap, and he opened it to the first page. His father's handwriting stared back at him, the familiar loops and slants of the letters he had seen on birthday cards and permission slips and notes left on the kitchen counter. But this was different. This was not a casual scribble or a quick reminder. This was careful, deliberate, the writing of a man who knew that what he was putting down on paper was important. The first entry was dated nearly a year before his parents died. Eli began to read, and as the pages turned, a picture began to form, a picture so dark and terrible that it made his stomach churn. His father had worked for Cascade Timber Corp for 3 years before quitting, and during that time he had begun to notice things that did not add up. Trucks that came and went at odd hours, areas of the forest that were off-limits to regular workers, streams that had once been clear and full of fish now running murky and lifeless. He had started asking questions, quietly at first, and the answers he got were evasive or hostile, so he had started digging on his own. What he found was worse than he could have imagined. Cascade Timber was not just a logging company. They were a front for something far more sinister. An affiliated mining operation, owned by the same parent corporation, was producing toxic waste, heavy metals, and chemical solvents, and other poisons, and instead of disposing of it properly, which was expensive and heavily regulated, they were dumping it in the mountains. They had found remote sites, far from prying eyes, and they were burying barrels of the stuff in the earth or simply pouring it into the watershed, letting the streams carry it away. The journal entries grew more detailed and more damning as Eli read on. His father had documented everything with the meticulous care of a man building a case. He recorded dates and times, license plate numbers of trucks, descriptions of the men he saw. He mapped the dump sites, marking their locations on hand-drawn charts. He took samples of water and soil, sealing them in jars and hiding them in various places on the mountain. He described the effects of the contamination, the dead fish floating in the streams, the birds that had disappeared, the strange sicknesses that had begun to appear in the towns downstream. People were getting ill, his father wrote. Children were getting ill, and no one knew why because no one knew what was being poured into their water. His father had gathered enough evidence to expose the entire operation. He had been preparing to take it to the authorities, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. He was going to blow the whistle and bring down Cascade Timber and everyone connected to them. And then he had died. A logging accident. A terrible tragedy. These things happen. Eli closed the journal, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. He understood now. He understood why his parents had been killed, and why his uncle, who worked for the company, had brought him to this cabin and left him to die. They thought the evidence had died with his father. They thought the secret was safe. But his father had been too smart for them. He had hidden the journal and the photographs in the one place no one else would ever think to look, in a hollow beneath a rock at a fishing spot known only to him and his young son. He had left the truth for Eli to find. Eli looked at the journal in his lap, and he felt something new rising in his chest, something hot and fierce that burned away the fear and the grief. It was anger. It was purpose. His parents had not died in an accident. They had been murdered, and Eli was holding the proof. Eli set the journal aside and reached for the photographs, his fingers trembling as he slipped off the rubber band that held them together. They were printed on heavy paper, the kind you got from a real camera and a real developing lab, and they were sharp and clear despite the time they had spent hidden in the waterproof pouch. He spread them out on the floor in front of him, and the firelight flickered across their glossy surfaces, illuminating images that told a story of greed and corruption and death. The first photographs were of the dump sites. Eli saw deep pits carved into the earth, their sides raw and brown, and at the bottom of each pit were dozens of barrels, their metal surfaces dull and rusted, their sides emblazoned with symbols he recognized from his father's safety lectures: skulls and crossbones, flames, exclamation points inside triangles, hazardous materials, poison. Some of the barrels were intact, stacked neatly like cargo waiting for shipment, but others were split open, their contents leaking into the soil, dark stains spreading outward like wounds. Other photographs showed streams and pools, their water discolored and murky, foam collecting along the banks, dead fish floating on the surface with their pale bellies turned toward the sky. Eli thought of the creek near his cabin, the clear, cold water he drank from every day, and he felt a wave of nausea roll through him. Was that water poisoned too? Was he slowly killing himself every time he took a drink? There were photographs of documents as well, official-looking papers spread out on a table and captured by his father's camera. Eli could not understand all of the technical language, but he recognized the words Environmental Impact Report, and he could see that numbers had been crossed out and replaced with different numbers, that sections had been whited out and rewritten. Falsified records, lies designed to hide the truth from regulators and inspectors and anyone else who might have stopped what Cascade Timber was doing. And then he came to the last photograph, and everything stopped. It was a picture of two men standing beside a pickup truck on a dirt road. One of the men was his father, his face serious, his posture tense, clearly not happy to be there. The other man was taller and broader, with a thick neck and a hard face and small dark eyes that Eli knew all too well. It was his Uncle Dale. Eli stared at the photograph, his breath frozen in his chest, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. His uncle and his father, together, clearly in the middle of some kind of confrontation. His father must have approached Dale, must have tried to talk to him, to warn him, maybe even to give him a chance to do the right thing, and Dale had refused. Or worse, Dale had reported back to his bosses at Cascade Timber and told them that his own brother-in-law was gathering evidence against them. The realization hit Eli like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. His uncle had not just abandoned him on this mountain to die. His uncle was part of it. He was on the company's payroll, complicit in their crimes. And when Eli's parents had threatened to expose the truth, Dale had helped to silence them. His own family, his own blood. Eli thought about the day his uncle had driven him up the mountain, the cold silence in the truck, the cruel words on the porch. You should have died with them. At the time, Eli had thought it was just cruelty, just the heartlessness of a man who did not want to be burdened with a child. But now he understood. Dale had meant it literally. Eli was a loose end, a potential witness, the son of the people who had tried to bring down the company. Leaving him alone in a crumbling cabin in the wilderness was not just abandonment. It was attempted murder, a quiet way of finishing the job without getting blood on his hands. Eli gathered the photographs with shaking hands and placed them back in the pouch with the journal. His grief was still there, vast and deep, but it had been joined by something else now, a cold, hard anger that settled into his bones like iron. His parents had been murdered, his uncle had helped kill them, and Eli was the only one left who knew the truth. Eli did not sleep that night. He lay on the cot with the waterproof pouch clutched to his chest, his mind churning, his emotions swinging wildly between grief and rage and a fear so profound it made his hands shake. Every sound from outside the cabin made him flinch, every creak of the old logs, every gust of wind through the gaps in the walls. He kept seeing his uncle's face in that photograph, the hard eyes, the set jaw, and he kept hearing those words over and over. You should have died with them. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He needed to show Maggie. She had known his parents, had hinted at the danger they were in, and she was the only person on this mountain he could trust. He ate a few bites of cold rabbit, more out of necessity than hunger, and then he set out through the forest, moving as fast as his legs would carry him. He had never been to Maggie's cabin before, but she had described the route to him, over the ridge and down into the next valley, following the creek until you see the smoke from my chimney. It took him nearly 2 hours, scrambling over rocks and pushing through underbrush, but finally he saw it, a small cabin much like his own, smoke curling from a stone chimney into the gray morning sky. Maggie was outside chopping wood when he emerged from the trees. She looked up, her axe pausing mid-swing, and something in Eli's face must have told her that this was not a social visit. She set the axe down and waited as he crossed the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps from the exertion and the emotion. What is it? She asked, her voice flat but her eyes sharp. Eli could not speak. He simply held out the pouch, and Maggie took it, her weathered hands surprisingly gentle. She opened it and pulled out the journal, flipping through the pages, her face unreadable. Then she looked at the photographs, one by one, and Eli watched as her expression changed. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin ashen and gray. Her jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched beneath her eye. When she came to the photograph of Eli's father and uncle, she closed her eyes for a long moment, as if absorbing a blow. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli told her about the fishing spot, about the hollow beneath the rock, about how his father had hidden the evidence where only Eli would think to look. Maggie listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she let out a long, slow breath and sank onto the chopping block as if her legs could no longer hold her. "I knew," she said quietly. "I always knew. Your parents came to me a few times, asking questions about the mountain, about the company. They were careful, but I could tell they were scared. And then they were dead, and it was too convenient, too neat." She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. "I had my suspicions, but suspicions are not proof. I am an old woman living alone on a mountain. I have no power, no connections, no way to fight people like that. So I stayed quiet, and I stayed alive, and I told myself there was nothing I could do." Eli felt tears burning in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He did not want to cry. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make someone pay for what had been done to his family. The anger inside him was like a living thing, hot and restless, demanding release. Maggie looked at him, and her gaze was hard and serious. "You have proof now, boy, real proof, and that makes you dangerous to them." She leaned forward, her voice dropping low and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. If Cascade Timber finds out you have this, if your uncle or anyone else connected to them learns what you have found, they will come for you. They killed your parents to keep this secret. They will not hesitate to kill a child." Eli felt the fear then, cold and sharp, cutting through the anger. He was 7 years old, alone on a mountain, holding evidence that could bring down a corporation and send men to prison. He was a target, and he had no way to protect himself. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice small and trembling. Maggie was silent for a long moment, staring at the journal in her hands. Then she looked up at him, and there was something new in her eyes, a spark of determination that had not been there before. "We get this to someone who can use it," she said. "Someone who can make them pay." Eli sat in Maggie's cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, the journal and photographs spread out on the small table between them. His mind was racing, turning over the problem again and again, searching for a solution. He could not stay on the mountain forever, hiding in his crumbling cabin, waiting for the day when his uncle or someone from Cascade Timber came to finish what they had started. He was a child, alone and vulnerable, and the evidence he possessed was worthless if it never reached anyone who could act on it. He needed to get off this mountain. He needed to find someone who would believe him, someone with the power to expose the truth and bring his parents' killers to justice. But who? He did not trust the local police. His father's journal mentioned that Cascade Timber had connections in the county government, people on their payroll who looked the other way or actively helped cover up their crimes. The sheriff, the county commissioners, the regulators who were supposed to protect the land and the water, they were all compromised. If Eli walked into the sheriff's office with his evidence, he might be handing it directly to the enemy. He looked at Maggie, desperation in his eyes. "There has to be someone," he said. "Someone who is not part of it, someone who will listen." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, as if she were searching through memories long buried. Then she nodded slowly, a name surfacing from the depths. "There is a man," she said, "a journalist. His name is Tom Carver, and he works for a newspaper in Cedar Falls. A few years back, he wrote some articles about Cascade Timber, asking questions about their operations, poking at things they wanted kept hidden. The company came down on him hard, threatened to sue, put pressure on his editors. They silenced him, but they did not break him." She looked at Eli, her eyes sharp. "If anyone will listen to you, boy, it will be him. He has a score to settle." Cedar Falls. Eli knew the name. It was a small city in the valley, the largest town in the region, maybe 50 miles away by road. But he did not have a road. He did not have a car. He was a 7-year-old boy on foot, and between him and Cedar Falls lay some of the most rugged and unforgiving terrain in the Cascade Mountains. "How do I get there?" he asked. Maggie pulled a piece of paper from a drawer and began to sketch a rough map, her hand moving quickly, drawing lines for ridges and rivers and trails. "It is a 2-day journey on foot," she said. "Maybe more, depending on the weather and how fast you can move. You will follow the creek down from your cabin until it joins the Whitewater River, then follow the river south through the canyon. There is an old logging road on the other side of the canyon that will take you down into the valley. From there, you can reach Cedar Falls." She looked up at him, and her expression was grave. "It is not an easy route. The terrain is rough, and the canyon can be dangerous, especially this time of year. There are animals, bears and cougars, and the weather can turn on you without warning. You will need to be careful, and you will need to be smart." Eli stared at the map, his heart pounding. 2 days through the wilderness, alone, carrying evidence that people had killed to protect. The fear was there, cold and heavy in his chest, but beneath it was something else, a resolve that had been hardening inside him ever since he read his father's journal. He thought about his parents, about the courage it had taken for them to stand up against Cascade Timber, to risk everything to expose the truth. They had not backed down, even when it cost them their lives. He was their son. He carried their strength. He would not back down either. "I will do it," he said, his voice steady. Maggie studied him for a long moment, and then she nodded, a flicker of something like respect in her eyes. "Then we need to get you ready," she said. "You leave at first light." They worked through the rest of the day and into the evening, preparing for Eli's journey. Maggie moved through her cabin with purpose, gathering supplies and equipment, her movements efficient despite her age and her limp. She pulled an old canvas pack from a chest in the corner, its fabric faded but sturdy, and she began to fill it with everything Eli would need. Food came first, enough for 3 days in case the journey took longer than expected. She wrapped dried rabbit meat in cloth, added a small bag of oats, a pouch of salt, a handful of the wild onions Eli had learned to identify. She included a small pot for boiling water, a tin cup, a box of matches sealed in wax to keep them dry. She added a knife, the same one she had given him for setting snares, and a coil of thin rope. She rolled up a wool blanket and strapped it to the bottom of the pack. "It is not much," she said, cinching the pack closed and handing it to Eli, "but it is enough if you are careful." She pulled out the map she had drawn and went over the route again, tracing the lines with her finger, drilling the details into his memory. She pointed out landmarks he should watch for, places where the trail split and he would need to choose the right path. She warned him about the areas to avoid, the sections of forest where Cascade Timber had active operations, where there would be workers and trucks and eyes that might see him and report back. "Stay off the roads," she said. "Stay in the trees. Travel during the day when you can see where you are going, but find a place to hide well before dark. Do not build a fire unless you absolutely have to, and if you do, keep it small and sheltered so the smoke does not give you away." Eli listened and nodded, committing every word to memory. The pack was heavy on his shoulders, heavier than anything he had carried before, but he did not complain. This was the weight of survival, the weight of justice, and he would bear it. They were sitting at the table, the map spread between them, when Maggie suddenly held up her hand, her body going rigid. She tilted her head, listening, and Eli listened too, straining his ears. At first he heard nothing but the wind in the trees and the crackle of the fire. Then it came, faint but unmistakable, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the growl of an engine, distant but growing louder, climbing the mountain. Someone was coming. Maggie's face went pale, and she rose from her chair with a speed that belied her years. She crossed to the window and peered out into the gathering dusk, her eyes scanning the tree line. Eli stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind flashing to the photograph of his uncle, to the men who had killed his parents, to the warning Maggie had given him. "If they find out you have this evidence, they will come for you." "You need to go," Maggie said, turning from the window. Her voice was calm but urgent, brooking no argument. "Now, right now." "But I am not ready," Eli stammered. "I do not know if I can do this alone." "You can, and you will," Maggie said. She grabbed the pack and thrust it into his arms, then took him by the shoulders and looked into his eyes. "You are your parents' son. You have their courage and their strength. You will make it to Cedar Falls, and you will find Tom Carver, and you will finish what your mother and father started. Do you understand me?" Eli nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Maggie released him and pointed to the back of the cabin. There is a door through the pantry. It leads out to the woods behind the cabin. Go that way. Head south toward the creek, and do not stop until you are well away from here. Do not come back for me. Do not worry about me. Just go. She pushed him toward the back of the cabin, and Eli went, his legs moving almost without his will. At the pantry door, he stopped and looked back. Maggie was standing by the front window, her silhouette framed by the fading light. She did not turn around. Go, she said again, and this time her voice cracked just a little. Eli pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold evening air, the pack on his back, the evidence against his chest, and the sound of the approaching engine growing louder behind him. He ran. Eli plunged into the forest behind Maggie's cabin, his small legs pumping, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pack bounced against his back, the straps digging into his shoulders, but he did not slow down. Branches whipped at his face and arms, and roots seemed to reach up from the ground to grab at his feet, but he kept moving, driven by pure terror. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer, and then it stopped, and Eli knew the truck had arrived at Maggie's cabin. He ran for another minute, maybe two, putting as much distance between himself and the cabin as he could, and then he stopped. He could not keep running blindly into the darkening forest. He needed to know what was happening. He needed to see. He turned and crept back toward the cabin, moving slowly now, carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. He found a spot behind a thick stand of fir trees, close enough to see the cabin but far enough to be hidden in the shadows. He crouched down, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and he watched. A truck was parked in front of the cabin, a big black pickup with the Cascade Timber logo on the door. Two men stood on the porch, and Maggie stood in the doorway facing them. The men were large and rough-looking, dressed in work clothes and heavy boots, and even from this distance Eli could see the menace in their postures. One of them was doing most of the talking, leaning in toward Maggie, his voice low and threatening. Eli could not hear the words, but he could hear the tone, aggressive and demanding. The other man stood back with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the cabin and the surrounding woods. Maggie stood her ground. She was small and old and alone, but she did not flinch, did not step back, did not show any sign of fear. She spoke to the men, her voice too quiet for Eli to make out, but her posture was defiant. She shook her head, and even from a distance Eli could read the message. She was denying something. She was lying for him. The first man's voice rose, loud enough now for fragments to reach Eli's ears. The boy. Seen him. Where is he? Maggie shook her head again and said something in response. Eli caught the words, ran off and probably dead. She was telling them he was gone, that he had fled into the wilderness weeks ago and had likely perished. She was giving him a chance to escape. The man did not believe her. He stepped closer, his body looming over hers, and he shouted something that Eli could not make out. Maggie did not move. She stood there like a stone, unyielding, and she said something back, something that made the man's face twist with rage. He struck her. It was a backhand blow, fast and vicious, and it caught Maggie across the face and sent her stumbling backward into the cabin. Eli saw her fall, saw her hit the floor, and something inside him snapped. A red haze descended over his vision, and his muscles tensed to spring. He wanted to run out there, to scream, to throw himself at the men and make them pay for what they had done, but he did not move. He could not move, because even through the rage and the fear, some part of his mind, the part that his father had trained to think clearly in a crisis, knew that it would be suicide. He was 7 years old. He was small and weak and unarmed. If he ran out there, the men would take him, and they would take the evidence, and everything his parents had died for would be lost. Maggie had lied for him. Maggie had been struck down for him, and the only way to honor that sacrifice was to stay hidden and survive and complete the mission she had sent him on. The men disappeared into the cabin, and Eli heard sounds from inside, crashes and thuds as they searched, overturned furniture, pulled things from shelves. They were looking for the evidence. They were looking for him. After what felt like an eternity, the men emerged. One of them was dragging Maggie by the arm, and Eli felt his stomach lurch. But they did not put her in the truck. They shoved her onto the porch and left her there, and one of them pointed a finger at her and said something that sounded like a warning. Then they got in the truck and drove away, the engine fading into the distance. Eli waited until the sound was completely gone, until the forest was silent again. Then he turned and ran south, toward the creek, toward Cedar Falls, tears streaming down his face and a cold resolve hardening in his heart. Eli ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out beneath him, and then he slowed to a walk, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The image of Maggie falling, the sound of the men's voices, the knowledge that they were hunting him, it all drove him forward like a hand pressing against his back. The forest around him was growing darker by the minute, the last light of day fading behind the mountains, and soon he was moving through a world of shadows and shapes, the trees looming like silent giants on every side. He knew the men would be back. They had not found what they were looking for at Maggie's cabin, and they would not give up. They would search the mountain, comb every trail and creek bed, check every cabin and hollow. They knew he was out here somewhere, a 7-year-old boy with evidence that could destroy them, and they would not rest until they found him. His only advantage was time, and he could not waste a single minute of it. He pulled his father's compass from his pocket and held it up, squinting at the needle in the dim light. South. He needed to go south, toward the creek that would lead him to the Whitewater River and eventually to Cedar Falls. He found the North Star through a gap in the canopy, fixed his bearing, and pushed on. The night was cold and getting colder, the temperature dropping as the darkness deepened. Eli's thin jacket was no match for it, and soon he was shivering, his teeth chattering, his fingers growing numb. But the cold also kept him alert, kept him focused, kept him moving when his body begged him to stop and rest. He stumbled over roots and rocks, his feet catching on obstacles he could not see. He fell more than once, his knees and palms scraping against the rough ground, but each time he got back up and kept going. He did not cry, he did not complain. He just moved, one foot in front of the other, following the compass needle through the endless dark. The forest at night was a different world than the one he had come to know during the day. The familiar sounds were gone, replaced by a symphony of noises that were strange and unsettling. Owls called from the branches overhead, their hoots echoing through the trees. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, fleeing from his approach. Once, he heard a larger animal moving parallel to him, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, and he froze, his heart in his throat, until the sound faded away. He thought about turning back. He thought about finding a place to hide, to curl up and wait for morning, to rest his aching body and his exhausted mind. But every time the thought surfaced, he pushed it down. He thought about his parents, about the sacrifice they had made. He thought about Maggie, lying on the floor of her cabin, struck down for protecting him. He thought about the journal in his pack, the photographs, the truth that had cost so many people so much. He was not just a boy trying to survive anymore. He was a boy with a mission, and the mission was bigger than his fear, bigger than his pain, bigger than himself. He checked the compass again and adjusted his course, angling toward what he hoped was the creek. The sound of running water reached his ears, faint at first but growing stronger, and he felt a surge of hope. He was on the right track. He was making progress. He pushed through a thicket of brush and found himself on the bank of the creek, the water black and silver in the starlight, rushing over rocks and fallen logs. He knelt and drank deeply, the cold water shocking his system but clearing his head. Then he stood and followed the creek downstream, letting it guide him through the darkness. The hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and determination. Eli lost track of time, lost track of everything except the compass and the creek and the need to keep moving. His world narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next beat of his heart, and somewhere in the long, dark night, something changed inside him. The fear was still there, and the grief, but they were no longer in control. He was in control. He was a boy on a mission, and he would not fail. Eli walked through the night and into the gray light of morning, his body moving on pure will alone. The creek had led him down through the forest and into the canyon Maggie had described, the walls rising steeply on either side, the river roaring over boulders and fallen trees. But somewhere in the darkness he had made a wrong turn, had followed a tributary instead of the main channel, and by the time the sun rose he knew he was lost. The landscape around him was unfamiliar, the landmarks Maggie had described nowhere to be seen. The canyon walls were steeper here, the forest thicker, and the river had dwindled to a stream that disappeared into a tangle of rocks and deadfall. He stopped and pulled out the hand-drawn map, but it was useless without knowing where he was. He tried the compass, but south was just a direction now, not a path, and he had no idea how far he had strayed or how to get back on course. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced it down. He could not afford to panic. He had to think, had to stay calm, had to figure out a way forward. He decided to climb higher, to find a ridge or a clearing where he could see the lay of the land and get his bearings. He started up the slope, his legs screaming in protest, his lungs gasping for air. The pack on his back felt like it was filled with stones, and every step was a battle. He had eaten the last of the dried rabbit meat the night before, and his stomach was a hollow ache. His water was gone, and his throat was parched and raw. He was running on empty, and he knew it. He was halfway up the slope when the sky began to change. The gray overcast that had hung above him all morning grew darker, thicker, and the wind picked up, cold and sharp, cutting through his thin jacket like a knife. He looked up and saw the clouds churning, black and angry, and he knew what was coming. He had learned to read the weather, just as Maggie had taught him, and this was bad. This was very bad. The storm hit with a fury that took his breath away. One moment there was wind and the threat of rain, and the next moment the sky opened up and water poured down in sheets, driven sideways by the gale. Eli was soaked in seconds, his clothes plastered to his skin, his hair streaming into his eyes. The temperature plummeted, and the rain turned to sleet, tiny pellets of ice that stung his face and hands. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him, could not hear anything over the roar of the wind and the hiss of the rain. He stumbled on, desperate to find shelter, his body shaking so violently he could barely control his limbs. He was so cold. He had never been so cold in his life. His fingers were numb, his feet were numb, and a terrible lethargy was creeping over him, a voice in his head telling him to just lie down, just rest for a minute, just close his eyes. He knew that voice. His father had warned him about it. It was the voice of hypothermia, the voice of death, and he could not listen to it. He pushed on, climbing blindly, and then his hand touched rock, solid rock, and he felt an opening, a gap in the stone, a cave. It was barely more than a hollow, a small space beneath an overhanging boulder, but it was dry, and it was out of the wind. He crawled inside, his body moving on instinct, and he pulled the pack in after him. The space was cramped and dark, but the relief from the storm was immediate. He curled into a ball, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to stop the shaking, but it would not stop. He was so cold, and he was so tired, and everything hurt. He thought about the blanket in his pack, knew he should get it out and wrap himself in it, but his hands would not obey him. His mind was foggy, his thoughts slow and scattered, and a strange warmth was spreading through his body, which he knew was wrong, knew was dangerous, but he could not fight it. He thought about his parents. He thought about Maggie. He thought about the journal and the photographs and the mission he had sworn to complete. He had come so far, had survived so much, and now it was going to end here, in a hole in the rock, alone and forgotten. The darkness closed in around him, and his eyes drifted shut, and his last thought before consciousness slipped away was that he was sorry. He was sorry he had failed. Eli opened his eyes to a world he did not recognize. He was lying in a bed, a real bed with clean sheets and a thick quilt, and the room around him was warm and filled with soft gray light filtering through curtained windows. For a long moment he could not remember where he was or how he had gotten there, and he thought perhaps he had died in the cave and this was some kind of dream or afterlife. Then he tried to move, and pain shot through his body, and he knew he was very much alive. His muscles ached, his throat was raw, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent pounding. But he was warm, and he was dry, and he was not in the cave anymore. He turned his head and saw a man sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching him. The man was in his 40s, with tired eyes and graying hair, and a face that looked like it had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He leaned forward when he saw Eli's eyes open, and his expression was a mixture of relief and curiosity. "You're awake," the man said. His voice was quiet, careful. "I was starting to worry." Eli tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. The man reached over and handed him a glass of water, and Eli drank it down, the cool liquid soothing his parched throat. "Where am I?" he managed to ask. "My name is Tom Carver," the man said. "I'm a journalist. I found you collapsed near a trail marker about 2 miles from here, half frozen and barely breathing. I brought you to my house. You've been unconscious for almost a full day. Tom Carver." The name cut through the fog in Eli's mind like a beam of light. This was the man Maggie had told him about, the journalist who had written about Cascade Timber, who had been silenced but not broken. Eli had been trying to find him, and somehow, against all odds, Tom Carver had found him instead. Eli pushed himself up in the bed, ignoring the pain that flared through his body. He looked around the room and saw his pack sitting on the floor near the door. "The journal," he said, his voice urgent. "The photographs. I have to show you." And so he did. He told Tom everything, from the beginning, from the day his uncle had abandoned him on the mountain to the discovery of his father's hidden evidence, to Maggie's warning to his desperate journey through the wilderness. Tom listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each new revelation. When Eli finished, Tom picked up the journal and began to read, and Eli saw something kindle in the man's eyes, something that looked like purpose, like hope, like the fire of a fight he had thought was lost but now saw could still be won. Tom Carver sat at his kitchen table, the journal open before him, the photographs spread out across the worn wooden surface. He had been reading for over an hour, his face growing paler with each page he turned, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. Eli sat across from him, wrapped in a blanket, a bowl of soup warming his hands, watching the journalist absorb the full scope of what his father had uncovered. When Tom finally looked up, his eyes were blazing with a mixture of fury and vindication. "I knew it," he said, his voice low and intense. "I knew they were dirty. I spent 2 years investigating Cascade Timber, interviewing workers, digging through records, trying to find proof. I knew the contamination was real, knew people were getting sick, but every time I got close, the evidence would disappear or witnesses would go silent. They threatened to sue me, threatened my family, got me fired from my paper." He shook his head, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "But this is everything. Your father did what I could not do. He got inside, he documented it all, and he hid it where they could never find it." Tom stood and paced the small kitchen, his mind clearly racing. "We cannot take this to the local authorities," he said. "The sheriff is in their pocket. Half the county commissioners are on their payroll. If we walk into that courthouse, the evidence will vanish, and we will vanish with it. We need to go higher, go outside the system they control." He stopped and turned to Eli, the state attorney general. "Her name is Grace Chen. She has a reputation for being incorruptible, for taking on powerful interests. If we can get this evidence to her, she will act on it. But how do we reach her?" Eli asked. Tom's expression darkened. "That is the problem. Cascade Timber has eyes everywhere, informants in every office, every agency. The moment we try to make contact through official channels, they will know. We need to reach her directly, in person, without anyone knowing." He looked at Eli, and there was a gravity in his gaze. "I have a contact in the Attorney General's office, someone I trust. I can reach out, try to arrange a meeting, but it will take time, and it will be dangerous. Once we make that call, the clock starts ticking. They will come for us." Eli thought about Maggie, about his parents, about everything he had lost and everything he had risked. "Then make the call," he said. The meeting took place 2 days later in a cabin on the far side of Cedar Falls, a safe house that Tom's contact had arranged. Eli insisted on being there, and Tom did not argue. This was Eli's fight more than anyone's, and he had earned the right to see it through. They arrived at dusk, the sky a bruised purple above the mountains, and they parked Tom's old car behind the cabin where it could not be seen from the road. The cabin was small and sparse, just a single room with a wooden table and a few chairs, the kind of place that hunters used during deer season and forgot about the rest of the year. Tom had checked it twice before they settled in, looking for signs that anyone had been there recently, but it was clean. They waited in the dim light of a single kerosene lamp, the journal and photographs laid out on the table between them, and Eli tried to calm the hammering of his heart. The investigator arrived alone, her headlights off as she pulled down the dirt track, her car coming to a stop beside Tom's. She slipped through the back door with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to secrecy, her movements quick and economical, her eyes scanning the room before she even stepped fully inside. Her name was Grace Chen, and she was exactly as Tom had described, stern and sharp-eyed, with a face that gave nothing away. She was younger than Eli had expected, maybe in her late 30s, but she carried herself with an authority that made her seem ageless. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a plain gray suit that looked like it had seen 1,000 meetings just like this one. She did not smile or offer pleasantries. She simply sat down in the chair across from them, folded her hands on the table, and said, "Show me what you have." Tom began to explain, leaning forward in his chair, his voice low and urgent. He started to lay out the background, The years he had spent investigating Cascade Timber, the dead ends and the threats, the way every lead had turned to smoke in his hands. But Grace held up a hand and cut him off. "I know your history with the company, Mr. Carver," she said, her tone not unkind but brooking no argument. "I read your articles before they were pulled. What I need now is the new evidence, and I want to hear it from the boy." Her gaze fixed on Eli, and he felt the weight of it like a physical thing. He found it. He carried it. He can tell me what it means. Eli swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his palms slick with sweat. But he did not look away. He thought about his parents, about Maggie, about everything he had survived to reach this moment. He thought about the promise he had made to himself in that cave on the mountain, the promise to see this through no matter what. He opened his mouth and began to speak. He told her everything, starting from the day his uncle had driven him up the mountain and left him at the cabin. He told her about the first night alone, about learning to survive, about Maggie and her teachings. He told her about finding the hidden pouch at the fishing spot, about reading his father's journal, about seeing his uncle's face in that photograph and understanding the depth of the betrayal. He told her about fleeing through the storm, about collapsing on the mountain, about waking up in Tom's house. He spoke clearly and simply, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. When he was finished, the cabin was silent. Grace picked up the journal and began to read, her eyes moving across the pages with careful attention. She examined each photograph, holding them up to the light of the lamp, studying the details, the hazard symbols on the barrels, the coordinates on the maps, the falsified documents with their crossed-out numbers and whited-out sections. Her expression remained neutral throughout, a mask of professional detachment, but Eli could see something shifting behind her eyes, a hardening, a resolve taking shape like steel being forged in a fire. "This is extraordinary," she said finally, setting down the last photograph. Her voice was quiet but intense. "If these documents are authentic, and I believe they are, this is one of the worst cases of environmental crime and corporate corruption I have ever seen. We are talking about systematic poisoning of an entire watershed, falsification of federal reports, bribery of local officials, and potentially multiple counts of murder." She looked at Eli, and for the first time her expression softened, just slightly, the hard lines around her mouth easing. "Your father was a brave man. He saw something terrible and he did not look away. He gathered evidence at great personal risk, and he died trying to protect people who will never know his name. I intend to finish what he started." She stood and gathered the evidence into a secure case she had brought with her, handling the journal and photographs with care, as if she understood their value not just as proof, but as relics of a man's courage. "I am opening an official investigation immediately," she said. "I will take this to the Attorney General tonight. But I need you both to understand something. This will take time. We are going up against a corporation with vast resources and powerful connections. They have lawyers and lobbyists and friends in high places, and the moment they learn what we are doing, your lives will be in danger." "They already are," Eli said quietly. Grace looked at him, and something flickered in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. She nodded slowly. "Then stay hidden," she said. "Stay safe, and trust me to do my job." They had 3 days of quiet, 3 days of waiting in Tom's small house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls, 3 days of hoping that Grace Chen would work her magic and bring the weight of the state down on Cascade Timber. Tom kept the curtains drawn and the lights low, and they moved through the house like ghosts, speaking in whispers, jumping at every sound from outside. Eli tried to rest, tried to eat, tried to recover his strength after the ordeal on the mountain, but the tension was a constant presence, a tightness in his chest that would not ease. He knew they were in danger. He knew that Cascade Timber had eyes everywhere, that the moment the company learned about the investigation they would come looking for the source. He just did not know when. On the 4th night, everything fell apart. Eli was asleep on the couch, his pack on the floor beside him, his father's compass clutched in his hand. He was dreaming of the mountain, of snow and wind and the dark mouth of the cave, when Tom shook him awake. Tom's face was pale in the moonlight that streamed through the window, his features drawn tight with fear. His eyes were wide with an urgency that made Eli's stomach drop, that told him everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. "We have to go," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "Right now." He did not explain, did not need to. Eli could hear it, the distant growl of engines coming up the road, more than one vehicle, moving fast. their headlights cutting through the darkness. The sound grew louder with every passing second, and Eli knew with a cold certainty that they were not late-night travelers or lost tourists. They were hunters, and they were coming for him. He grabbed his pack, the same pack he had carried over the mountain, and followed Tom to the back door. His hands were shaking, and his heart was hammering against his ribs, but his mind was clear. He had been hunted before. He had survived before. He would survive again. They slipped out into the cold night air, just as headlights swept across the front of the house, illuminating the windows, throwing long shadows across the lawn. Eli heard the screech of tires, the slam of car doors, the shouts of men, and then he and Tom were running, sprinting across the backyard, their feet pounding against the frozen ground. They reached the tree line and plunged into the woods, the darkness swallowing them whole. Behind them, the sounds of the assault continued. Eli heard glass breaking, wood splintering, furniture being overturned. He heard more shouts, angry and frustrated, the sounds of men tearing Tom's house apart, searching for something, searching for them. The noise faded as they pushed deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them, the branches whipping at their faces and grabbing at their clothes. Tom led the way, moving with a surprising speed for a man his age, his knowledge of the local terrain guiding them through the darkness. Eli followed close behind, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold air burning in his lungs, the fear of fist clenched around his heart. After what felt like an eternity, Tom slowed and pulled Eli down behind a fallen log, both of them gasping for air, their chests heaving. They listened, straining to hear over the rush of blood in their ears, but the sounds of pursuit had faded. The forest was silent around them, the only noise the whisper of wind through the branches and the distant hoot of an owl. For now, they had escaped. "What happened?" Eli managed to ask between breaths, his voice thin and trembling. Tom's face was grim, his jaw set in a hard line. "Someone talked," he said. "Someone in the Attorney General's office, or someone who saw us at the meeting. The investigation leaked, and now Cascade Timber knows. They know we have the evidence, and they know we gave it to Chen." Eli felt the world tilt beneath him, felt the ground shift under his feet, all of it, the journey over the mountain, the days of hiding, the meeting with Grace. It had all been for nothing. "Then it is over," he said, his voice hollow with despair. "They will destroy everything. My parents died for nothing." "No," Tom said fiercely, gripping Eli's shoulder and looking him hard in the eye. "Grace has the evidence. She has copies of the journal, the photographs, everything. She made duplicates the night we met, and she sent them to secure locations outside the state. Even if they find us, even if they kill us, they cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The truth is out there now, and it is not going back in the box. But they will try," Eli said quietly. "Yes," Tom agreed, his voice heavy. "They will try. And that means we have to stay alive long enough for Grace to finish this. We have to keep moving, stay hidden, trust that she is doing her job while we do ours." They pushed themselves to their feet and continued deeper into the woods, two fugitives in the night, hunted by men who had already killed and would not hesitate to kill again. Behind them, through the bare branches of the trees, Eli could see the lights of Tom's house beginning to glow orange as flames licked at the windows. Cascade Timber was burning everything, destroying every trace, trying to erase the evidence of their crimes, but they were too late. The truth was already out, copied and distributed, safe in the hands of people who would use it. The fire behind them was not a victory. It was the desperate act of men who knew they were losing. And as Eli followed Tom through the dark forest, his pack on his back and his father's compass in his pocket, he felt something new kindling in his chest. It was not fear, though the fear was still there. It was not grief, though the grief would never fully leave him. It was determination, hard and bright, a flame that the cold and the darkness could not extinguish. They had tried to silence his parents. They had tried to kill him, and now they were trying to burn away the truth. But the truth was stronger than fire, and Eli was going to make sure it came to light. They moved through the forest for hours, staying off the roads, navigating by the stars and Tom's knowledge of the land. Eli's legs ached, and his lungs burned, but he did not complain. He had walked further and suffered worse on his journey from the mountain, and he knew that stopping now could mean death. Tom had a destination in mind, a place he and Grace had agreed upon in case everything went wrong, and he led them toward it with grim determination. They reached it just as dawn was breaking. a small hunting cabin set back from a dirt road, surrounded by dense pines. 2 black SUVs were parked in front, and men in dark jackets stood near the door, their hands resting on holstered weapons. Eli's first instinct was to run, but Tom put a hand on his shoulder. "It is all right," he said. "They are with us." Grace appeared in the doorway of the cabin and waved them forward. Her face was tired but triumphant, and for the first time since Eli had met her, she was almost smiling. They hurried across the clearing and into the cabin, and one of the marshals closed the door behind them. Inside, the cabin was warm and lit by electric lamps, and a radio on the table crackled with official chatter. Grace gestured for them to sit, and she poured them both cups of hot coffee before settling into a chair across from them. "It is done," she said. "The Attorney General moved faster than I have ever seen. We presented your evidence to a federal judge yesterday, and he issued arrest warrants within hours. As of 6 o'clock this morning, raids are being conducted on Cascade Timber's headquarters, their logging sites, and the homes of their top executives." Eli felt his heart stop. His hands tightened around the warm mug. "My uncle," he said. "Dale is on the list," Grace confirmed. Her expression softened as she looked at him. "I know this is not easy for you. He is family. But the evidence against him is overwhelming. He was part of the conspiracy from the beginning, and he was directly involved in the cover-up of your parents' deaths. He will be arrested and charged along with the others." Eli did not know what to feel. There was no satisfaction, no joy, just a hollow ache where his family used to be. His uncle had helped kill his parents and had left him on a mountain to die, and now he would go to prison. It was justice, but it did not feel like victory. Grace leaned forward. "I want you to understand something, Eli. What you did, what your father did, it mattered. The contamination from those dump sites was spreading. People in the valley were getting sick, and it was only going to get worse. By bringing this evidence forward, you saved lives. Your parents would be proud of you." Eli nodded, but he could not speak. The tears he had been holding back for so long finally spilled over, and he let them come. Tom put a hand on his shoulder, and Grace gave him a moment of silence, and in that small cabin surrounded by marshals and radio chatter, Eli finally allowed himself to grieve. They drove into the city 3 days later, after the raids had been completed and the arrests had been made. Grace thought it was important for Eli to see it, to witness the end of the story he had fought so hard to write. Tom drove, his hands steady on the wheel, and Eli sat in the back seat, the journal resting in his lap, his father's compass in his pocket. The streets of Cedar Falls were lined with news vans and reporters, cameras pointed at the tall glass building that served as Cascade Timber's headquarters. A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. People who had heard the news, people who had been sickened by the contamination, people who wanted to see justice done. Police cars and federal vehicles were parked at every entrance, their lights flashing red and blue. Tom pulled the car to a stop across the street, and they waited. Eli watched through the window, his breath fogging the glass, his heart a steady drum in his chest. He did not know what he was feeling. It was too big, too complicated, a tangle of emotions he could not begin to unravel. And then the doors of the building opened, and they brought them out. The executives came first, men in expensive suits with their hands cuffed behind their backs, their faces blank or angry or afraid. Eli did not know their names, but he knew what they had done, knew the poison they had poured into the mountain and the lies they had told to cover it up. They were led to waiting cars and driven away, and Eli felt nothing. Then his uncle appeared. Dale walked through the doors, flanked by 2 federal marshals, his wrists bound in steel, his head bowed. He looked smaller than Eli remembered, diminished, as if the power he had wielded had been stripped away along with his freedom. He did not struggle or protest. He just walked, one foot in front of the other, toward the car that would take him to jail. Eli stared at him through the window, waiting for something to rise up inside him, satisfaction or triumph or even anger, but there was nothing. There was only a hollow ache, a vast emptiness where his family used to be. This man had helped kill his parents. This man had left him on a mountain to die. And now he was going to prison, and it did not change anything. His mother and father were still gone. They were never coming back. No amount of justice could undo what had been done. The car carrying his uncle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic, and Eli let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. He looked down at the journal in his lap, at his father's handwriting on the cover, and he ran his fingers over the worn leather. He thought about his parents, about the courage it had taken for them to stand up against Cascade Timber, to risk everything to protect people they had never met. They had not lived to see this day, but they had made it possible. They had gathered the evidence, hidden it where only their son would find it, and trusted him to finish what they started, and he had. He was 7 years old, and he had walked through fire and snow and darkness, and he had brought the truth into the light. He had honored his parents. He had made their sacrifice mean something. Tom looked at him in the rearview mirror. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Eli nodded, though he was not sure it was true. He would never be okay, not completely, but he would survive. He would go on, and he would carry his parents with him, in his heart, for the rest of his life. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill overlooking the valley, the grass green and soft beneath Eli's feet, the sky above a clear and endless blue. It was spring now, the snow long melted from the mountains, the trees heavy with new leaves, the air warm and sweet with the smell of wildflowers. Eli stood before 2 simple headstones, side by side, bearing the names of his mother and father and the dates that marked the boundaries of their 2 short lives. He had never been here before. In the chaos after their deaths, no one had thought to bring him, and then he had been abandoned on the mountain, and then he had been fighting to survive, and then he had been fighting for justice. But now, months later, with the trials concluded and the sentences handed down and the company dismantled, he had finally come to say goodbye. He was not the same boy who had been dumped at that crumbling cabin in the wilderness. That boy had been small and frightened, overwhelmed by a world that had turned cruel and cold. The boy who stood here now was different. He was still small, still only 7 years old, but there was a quietness in him, a stillness that had not been there before. He had walked through darkness and come out the other side, and the journey had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Maggie stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She had recovered from the beating the men had given her, though she walked with a more pronounced limp now and tired more easily. She had refused to leave the mountain, had gone back to her cabin as soon as she was able, but she had come down today for this. She had known his parents, had respected them, and she wanted to pay her respects. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was enough. Eli knelt and placed a bundle of wildflowers on each grave, flowers he had picked that morning from a meadow near Maggie's cabin. He looked at the names carved in stone, and he thought about his mother's laugh and his father's hands and the home they had made together, the home that had been taken from him. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was not the same crushing weight it had once been. It had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of who he was, and he had learned to carry it. "I finished it," he whispered to the stones. "I found what you hid, and I got it to the right people, and they stopped the company. They are all going to prison, even Uncle Dale." He paused, his throat tight. "I am going to be okay. Tom and Grace set up a trust for me from the settlement. I will have enough to live on, enough to go to school, enough to build a life." He reached out and touched his mother's headstone, the granite cool and smooth beneath his fingers. "I promise I will make you proud. I will live a good life. I will help people, the way you tried to help people. I will not forget." He stood and looked at Maggie, and she nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He turned and walked down the hill toward the car where Tom and Grace were waiting, leaning against the hood, giving him space. Behind him, the mountains rose into the sky, vast and silent, the same mountains that had nearly killed him and had ultimately saved him. He did not look back. His future was ahead.